Welcome everyone. I guess we can get started. Find your seats or a seat. Thank you for coming. This is a great turnout. Really very pleased. My name is Tom Chandler. I'm Dean of the Arnold School of Public Health, and this is our 40th anniversary year. We had a big celebration planned back in October, and the Great Flood of 2015 canceled it. But we've rescheduled it to March 18th of next year. There'll be a lot of events. Please pay attention to our website. We'll have a lot of lectures and other things going on the 18th. The website is simply sph.sc.edu, and I hope you'll join us again then. But thank you for coming out. This lecture series is a community lecture series. We try to design it around speakers and topics that we know the community are interested in broadly, topics around public health, and particularly topics this year around health disparities. I want to say a few remarks about our former dean, Winona Vernberg, for whom the lecture's named. Winona was our founding dean. She served as dean for almost 20 years. Her bio's in your program, so I'm not going to read what she was all about, but Winona died unexpectedly in 2008, and we started this lecture series in her honor. She was an amazingly bright dean, which is unusual for deans, you'll find. She was very tough, but she was also very kind. She was the only administrator I've met in my 25 years in this university that could make my knees shake. She hired me. She said it was the dumbest decision she ever made, and she said I'd never get tenure, but I did, and proved her wrong. But she was a great friend, and she did care deeply for me and many of the folks that were around 20 or 20 plus years ago. She grew up in very white Kansas, and she was always interested and really perpetually intrigued by the poor state of public health, and particularly the poor state of health generally around disparities and rural African American communities in South Carolina and the South generally. By training, she was a parasitologist, and she had these really interesting pictures in her office that she would share with biologists like myself. She wouldn't share them with everybody, but pictures of hookworm and tapeworm collected from little African American children that I thought were taken abroad, but actually they were pictures that were taken in the PD here in South Carolina in the 60s and 70s. And in those days, and I imagine Sherman, who's from Hartsville, will probably remember, we had a serious problem in South Carolina and South generally with parasite loads in children, and that was Winona's research passion. But she kept that dedication to health disparities, to cultivating really a culture in the Arnold School. It wasn't called the Arnold School in those days, but of hiring faculty that cared about health disparities, cared about social justice, and it would work extensively with our students and get grants and good things to promote that work. Now today, the Arnold School shifted our focus quite a bit. We don't do much with parasitology or public health parasitology anymore. We're more focused on chronic diseases, things like diabetes, heart disease, stroke, cancer, renal disease, and particularly the root causes of these morbidities, such as poor nutrition, built environments that are not supportive of health, and low health IQ generally in our population. So today's speaker, Professor Sherman James, who Katrina Walsman will introduce in a moment, so I won't give you a lot of bio on Sherman just yet. But Sherman's an especially appropriate choice for today's lecture, particularly in this state, in these times, in this university, given recent events. Sherman, your research developing and testing, particularly the John Henryism hypothesis, as well as your many other contributions in social epidemiology, I know personally have been profoundly influential on our faculty and especially our students in the Arnold School, most or many of which are working to eliminate health disparities around race and also culture, not just here in South Carolina, but throughout the South and indeed around the world. So thank you for joining us today, Professor, and I'd ask Katrina to come up and make a few remarks about your background. Katrina, and thank you everyone for coming.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming today. Before I introduce our speaker, Dr. Sherman James, I just wanted to make a few acknowledgments in terms of bringing him here to campus, the Dean of the Arnold School of Public Health who sponsored this lecture series, and also to the Provost Office for providing us funds to bring him to campus for a week to work with the Population and Health Research Group. And our group is a group of interdisciplinary scholars who are working towards issues around social and health equity. So I'm extremely honored to introduce Dr. Sherman James today, and you guys have a bio in the program, so I won't go into all of those details, but just a few notes other than his influential work developing the John Henryism hypothesis. Dr. James has strong ties to the U.S. South. He spent his career mostly in the U.S. South, started at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in the Department of Epidemiology, and then was at the University of Michigan for a number of years before he returned to Duke University in the School of Public Policy. He currently holds the title of the Susan B. King Professor Emeritus of Public Policy at Duke University and serves as a research professor of epidemiology at Emory University. In addition to his profoundly influential work as a scholar, Dr. James is also, and maybe I can say more importantly, an incredible mentor and teacher. As a graduate student at the University of Michigan, I was very fortunate to be able to take his social epidemiology course. I'm getting all nervous. One of the most popular courses offered in the School of Public Health. My experience, I don't remember. It must have been an A. I don't know. But I do remember that my experiences in that class shaped the way that I currently think about race, culture, and health inequities, and it has had lasting impact on my own scholarship and my own teaching. And every once in a while, some of you, most of you hopefully, have come across a professor who was able to challenge you, to inspire you, whose efforts in the classroom led to a shift in your perspective, interest, or passion. Dr. James was one of those professors for me, and I know he's been that professor for many others. So it's my pleasure, I'm sorry, to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Sherman James.
Well, thank you very much, Katrina, for that really wonderful, heartwarming introduction. I think you did get an A in that class. That's probably why she was so instrumental in working with Dean Chandler to invite me to come in and talk. And so I want to thank both of you, really, and especially Dean Chandler, for the invitation to come and give this year's Vernberg lecture. I did not know Dr. Vernberg personally, but I was a young, green behind the ears assistant professor of epidemiology at UNC Chapel Hill, that other Carolina, back in the mid-1970s. And I was certainly aware of her influential role in founding this School of Public Health and then providing outstanding leadership for it, as Dean Chandler has said, for nearly 20 years. So it's a real privilege to be included among the people who have been invited to come and pay tribute to her contributions to what is now a really outstanding School of Public Health. Amazingly, this is really my first time on the campus of the University of South Carolina. I grew up just 70 miles from here, a little town called Hartsville, home of Coker College and Sunoco Products Company. It's a bit more charming place now than it was when I was growing up, happy to say. But this is an impressive campus, and in my couple of days stay here so far, I've met some really impressive people doing some really interesting and important things, and so I will leave on Friday with a real appreciation of the work that's being done here and the promise of the faculty, particularly the younger faculty, and the graduate students who I've had the privilege of meeting. I've really enjoyed myself so far, and so I want to thank you all again for inviting me. Thanks all of you for coming out today as well. Now, I have some prepared comments because, as my students know, and there are two of them at least that I recognize in the audience, in addition to Katrina, Professor Jay Pearson, who is now at Duke University. And these were two of the best students in the doctoral program in the School of Public Health and Health Behavior at the University of Michigan when I taught there. So it's a pleasure to see them again. So as they know, if I don't discipline myself with respect to a text for certain occasions, I will go off on interesting little byways and use up all the time that has been allotted to me, and I don't want to do that. So I have some prepared remarks, and they will run for about 40 minutes. And I hope that this will leave us ample time at the end for a very fruitful discussion. So when Katrina asked me, I guess almost a year ago now, to come and spend a few days with faculty and students who are interested in health disparities research, because I think so highly of her, I readily agreed. And I thought, well, when the time comes for me to actually make the visit, I would give a more or less straightforward health disparities lecture based in large part on some of my own boring research. But throughout this year, throughout 2015, when an epidemic lethal use of force against unarmed black people by police and non-police alike became so troublesome, I knew that I could not give a conventional talk on U.S. racial health disparities. So as horrific as all of these unnecessary deaths were, a real turning point for me was the cold-blooded murder of the 9 Bible study members in Charleston, South Carolina by Dylan Ruth on June 17th of this year, followed by the debate over whether the Confederate flag represented heritage or hate, and whether or not it should be removed from the grounds of the state capitol building. So as you now know, I'm a native of South Carolina, so what happened in Charleston on that day was deeply personal for me, as it was for you. So from my home in Atlanta, I followed the unfolding events very closely, like you. And like you, I was utterly shocked by the hatred this 21-year-old young man expressed toward black people. You are raping our women and taking over our country, he said to his victims before shooting them. And then just 2 days after the murder, like you, I was blown away by the amazing generosity of spirit that the victim's family member showed him. You took something very precious away from me, said Nadine Collier, daughter of 70-year-old Ethel Lance, her voice rising in anguish. I will never talk to her ever again. I will never be able to hold her again, but I forgive you and have mercy on your soul. When, after an agonizing debate, the South Carolina state legislatures voted to remove the flag from the grounds of the state capitol, something very few of us South Carolinians thought would ever happen in our lifetime, it dawned on me that something truly important had happened, if only symbolically, and that maybe this awful tragedy had something to teach those of us who have made achieving racial equity in health and other spheres our life's work. First, it probably teaches us something about the conditions under which progress toward racial equity in America, however modest, is likely to occur. And second, it surely teaches us something about the steepness of the mountain we are trying to climb. By black image in the white mind, I'm referring at the most superficial level to the explicit, stereotypical, negative views that many, but certainly not all, whites have of black Americans. As shown in this next slide, the attitudes of white Americans regarding whether the rights of blacks should be restricted in certain areas have been trending in a favorable direction since the early 1970s, as have more or less their attitudes regarding whether blacks are as hardworking and intelligent as whites. But as we know, an explicit stereotype is one that you consciously think about and report, whereas an implicit stereotype is one that occurs outside of your conscious awareness and control. This slide makes the distinction quite nicely. Namely, expression of explicit stereotypes is conscious, effortful, and relatively slow, whereas an implicit stereotype resides in the unconscious mind and is effortless, automatic, and fast. Oprah, Denzel, and Beyonce notwithstanding, here is a list of the common, mostly ugly stereotypes of black Americans. We are, allegedly, angry, threatening, prone to criminal behavior, less intelligent, do not value education, lazy, prefer government handouts over self-reliance and personal responsibility, poor parents, sexually promiscuous, and 3 ambiguously positive traits: athletic, musical, and comical. That is, we are entertaining. All of these can be denied explicitly, but still held implicitly. These negative stereotypes permeate mainstream American culture, and they have a very long history in American intellectual thought. Thomas Jefferson, for example, after extolling the physical beauty and intelligence of whites and denigrating these qualities in blacks, may have voiced the opinion many founding fathers held about blacks when he wrote in his famous 1785 treatise, Notes on the State of Virginia, the following: I advance, therefore, as a suspicion only, that the blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in endowment of body and mind. Among the Romans, emancipation required one effort. Now, prior to this particular excerpt, he spent several paragraphs going into some considerable detail about the nature of slavery in the Roman Empire. The slave, and now he's referring to the Roman Empire, the slave, when made free, might mix with, without staining, the blood of the master. But with us, a second is necessary, unknown to history. When freed, he, that is the black slave in America, is to be removed beyond the reach of admixture. The title of my talk, The Black Image in the White Mind, is not original. I actually stole it from 2 sources. The first of which is this terrific 1971 book by the late, great Stanford University historian George Frederickson, who summarized how late 19th century white American intellectuals, allied with the ascendant and eventually dominant biological school, viewed black Americans. The biological school saw the Negro as a pathetically inept creature who was a slave to his emotions, incapable of progressive development and self-government because he lacked the white man's enterprise and intellect. I'm also indebted to this excellent 2000 book by Entman and Rujecki, who criticized U.S. mass media, especially television and films, for perpetuating negative stereotypes of black Americans. Explicitly, media images deny white superiority and the legitimacy of white privilege. Beyond this, media images still contain traces of long-standing cultural presumptions, not only of essential racial difference, but of the hierarchy that idealizes whiteness. So if, as I will argue, one of the greatest, if not the greatest challenge we face today in achieving racial equity in America is the widespread, unconscious anti-black racial bias, then it is important that we figure out how to build partnerships with scholars, activists, and policymakers who have taken up this charge. What scientific tools are being used and what knowledge is being produced that might help us move forward? I've just begun to think about these questions myself, so I have no definitive answers to present. But I'm fascinated by the knowledge being generated by social neuroscientists researchers who study how cultural forces condition the human brain to respond to people of a different race or of an impoverished social class background. And I hope that this new knowledge can help us gain some additional traction as we continue climbing the steep mountain toward racial equity that I referred to earlier. Let me begin then by discussing three approaches that have been developed to measure unconscious racial bias. I will follow this with a selective and I hope informative summary of studies using one of these approaches. The studies will focus on three social systems that play an important role either directly or indirectly in determining the magnitude of racial inequities, especially health inequities, in our society. These are the criminal justice system, the healthcare system, and the education system. I'll also offer some suggestions for interventions at both the structural and individual level that are needed within each system. At the end, I'll pose two questions for your consideration, questions which I believe encapsulate the challenges we face. I'll then return to the event that galvanized my interest in this particular topic, the Charleston Church Massacre, and the lessons it may have for us. And I'll conclude with some ideas regarding a possible way forward. The first approach is the implicit association test, or the IAT. I won't spend much time on this one because of the three approaches, the IAT is probably the most familiar. Briefly, if a research subject presses a designated computer key faster when the face of a white person is paired with a word connoting a positive attribute, say intelligent, than when the face of a black person is paired with that same positive attribute, then an unconscious pro-white bias is indicated. The developers of the IAT methodology say that a substantial pro-white bias exists if the overall black-white difference score, measured in milliseconds, is equal to or greater than plus 0.50. IAT researchers also say that unlike explicit or conscious racial bias, implicit racial bias scores do not change very much over time. Subliminal race priming, the second approach, involves exposing research subjects to computer images of black and white faces too fast for the conscious but not for the unconscious mind to detect. Here's a stylized example of subliminal race priming in a weapons identification task. A black or white face flashes on a densely patterned computer screen at a speed too fast to register consciously in the human mind, but it registers unconsciously. In the next step, the research subject is asked to press a designated computer key as quickly as possible if a fast appearing and then fast disappearing object is a gun, and a different key if the object is a common tool like a pair of pliers. If the research subject correctly identifies the gun faster at the subliminal exposure to a black face than a white face, this suggests a stronger subconscious association between black and gun than between white and gun, an association indicative of an unconscious black criminality stereotype. The third approach is functional resonance imaging, or fMRI, which in this particular context can be thought of as the socio-neuroscience of prejudice. In this approach, changes in blood flow in target regions of the brain are measured via neuroimaging as research subjects are exposed to photos of black or white faces. We now know that the amygdala, located near the base of the brain as shown here, lights up, so to speak, when an individual is exposed to something or someone perceived to be threatening. Studies involving both blacks and whites show more amygdala activation when exposed to a photo of a person of the opposite race versus a person of the same race. In the study of whites referenced on this slide, the researchers observed, as expected, greater amygdala activation when study participants were exposed to photos of blacks. Moreover, the level of amygdala activation was correlated with a potentiated startle response elsewhere in the brain. And interestingly, amygdala activation was also correlated with implicit pro-white bias as measured by the IAT. In a second study, amygdala activation was not correlated with explicit racial bias as measured by a paper and pencil questionnaire. And very interestingly, its activation was completely eliminated when whites viewed faces of familiar or positively regarded blacks. Think Will Smith. I'll turn now to studies of the consequences of implicit racial bias in three major social systems. The numbers 1 through 3 under systems have corresponding numbers for the societal or population health consequences of implicit racial bias. First, the criminal justice system. This slide shows the dramatic increase in incarceration rates, especially for black Americans, see the top line, beginning in the early to mid-1980s, a consequence of increased arrests and longer mandatory prison sentences for mostly non-violent crimes such as the possession or sale of illegal drugs. As shown here, this dramatic increase in mass incarceration impacted black men who dropped out of high school or who had only a high school education far more than it impacted college graduates. I'll say more about the importance of a college education later. Among black men, non-college graduates are also more likely than college graduates to have deadly or at least rough physical encounters with the police, though some well-known exceptions exist. The rough physical encounter between New York City Police and James Blake, the former tennis star, on September the 9th of this year, and the roughing up of Henry Louis Gates, the well-known Harvard professor, in his own home by a Cambridge, Massachusetts police officer 6 years ago, come to mind. Furthermore, since young black men are often presumed to be up to no good, especially if they're somewhere they're not supposed to be, they quickly become surveillance targets by the police or others. As noted on this slide, in more than 20 shoot, don't shoot video game simulation studies, white college students were faster and more accurate when shooting armed black men than armed white men. They were also faster and more accurate when not shooting unarmed white men than unarmed black men. Prior to 2007, no similar video game studies had ever been conducted with community living adults. And because police officers could be more trigger-happy than civilians when dealing with black men, as indicated here, Carell and his colleagues wanted to know if police officers differ from a group of average white citizens when making a decision to shoot or don't shoot in a video game simulation that randomly presented images of armed and unarmed black and white men. Their findings were published in this interestingly titled article. The study took place in Denver, Colorado, where the researchers were able to take advantage of a national meeting of police officers being held there. They recruited a sample of officers from this national meeting, plus a sample of Denver police officers, and then added a group of white community volunteers. Mean response time in milliseconds that each group pressed the shoot or don't shoot computer key is shown on the vertical axis. The gun versus no gun condition for each group is shown on the horizontal axis. As the slide indicates, in the gun condition, all three groups were faster to press the shoot button when the computer image was a black man rather than a white man. Conversely, all three groups were faster to press the don't shoot button in the no gun condition when the image was a white man rather than a black man. Note, however, that in the no gun condition, both groups of police officers were somewhat faster than community members to press the don't shoot button when the image was that of a black man. This last finding indicates that the police exercise somewhat greater caution than community members when deciding whether to shoot a black man who might be unarmed. Moving beyond video game simulations to the real world, a recent telephone survey by Geller and colleagues in New York City found that aggressive policing, defined as rough physical handling of young men, was associated with elevated anxiety and PTSD symptoms, especially if the young men perceived the police to have acted unfairly. This slide presents a short list of needed structural and individual level interventions for the criminal justice system. Fortunately, there is now some forward movement, happily bipartisan in nature, on sentencing reform for nonviolent crimes. In addition, police departments in several large cities around the country have begun to work with social psychologists to reduce unconscious racial bias by policemen. Clearly, these are two very positive developments. Turning now briefly to the healthcare system, I will highlight just a few key points and then summarize findings from two really interesting recent studies. The influential 2003 Unequal Treatment publication by the Institute of Medicine documented widespread racial disparities in the U.S. healthcare system, and the IOM committee concluded that these disparities probably result from physicians' negative stereotypes, unconscious or conscious, of racial minorities. Most physicians have to manage very complex cognitive tasks and typically do so under considerable time pressure. Solid research has determined that this is precisely the circumstance that creates openings for unconscious racial bias to influence doctor-patient communication and quite possibly treatment recommendations. In a very interesting 2012 paper, Lisa Cooper and colleagues at the Johns Hopkins Medical Center analyzed audio tapes of clinical encounters between 40 primary care providers and their patients to determine if implicit bias, as measured by the IAT, influenced doctor-patient communication. They observed a moderate, let's just say mean IAT score of positive 0.26 of pro-white implicit bias among physicians as a whole. Male physicians showed more implicit pro-white bias than female physicians. White and Asian physicians showed more implicit bias than black physicians. And self-described politically conservative physicians showed more implicit racial bias than self-described liberals. In terms of doctor-patient communication, for black patients, implicit pro-white bias by physicians was associated with greater verbal dominance, slower speech, and longer patient visits. For white patients, on the other hand, physician pro-white bias was associated with more patient-centeredness, faster speech, and more positive affect for the patient. In a Denver-based study of implicit bias toward blacks and Latinos by white primary care providers and also by white community members, Blair and colleagues found roughly equal levels of implicit pro-white bias for doctors and community members. Hence, as with white police officers, white physicians seem to have similar levels of unconscious racial bias as white Americans not occupying these powerful authority positions. Given the potential life and death consequences of their decisions, however, a strong case can be made that as far as unconscious racial bias is concerned, police officers and physicians should be held to a higher standard than average citizens. Here's a short list of some needed structural and individual level interventions for our healthcare system. Perhaps some small, isolated steps are being taken to address unconscious racial bias in the U.S. healthcare system, but I am unaware of any major initiatives to date. The education system. Here my focus will not be on how implicit bias by powerful authority figures like police officers and physicians impacts black Americans. Instead, my focus will be on how frequent exposure to subtle negative stereotypes within the education system undermines academic achievement by black students. thus feeding the school dropout problem at both the high school and college level. So while the lens I will use when discussing the education system is different from the one used to discuss criminal justice and health care, the disproportionate impact of negative stereotypes, in this case on black students, is the same. This slide shows that the gap in high school graduation for blacks, see the top left panel of the slide, and whites, the top right panel, had closed significantly by the mid-1980s. But the racial gap in percent college graduates, as shown in the two bottom panels, has widened in recent decades due to a faster increase in college attainment by whites. The advantages of a college degree, especially in today's economy, are considerable. So the growing black-white racial gap in college attainment is a cause for real concern. In my view, the most promising work aimed at closing the black-white educational achievement gap is that by Claude Steele and his collaborators dealing with stereotype threat. This quote from Steele, a social psychologist who is now the provost at University of California, Berkeley, is from a 1992 article that appeared in The Atlantic, in which he discusses how the stigma or the negative stereotype of not being smart undermines black academic achievement at all levels of education. Steele wrote, "I have long suspected a culprit that can undermine black achievement as effectively as a lock on the schoolhouse door. The culprit I see is stigma, the endemic devaluation many blacks face in our society and schools. It is capable, in the words of Irving Goffman, of breaking the claim that one's human attributes have on people. Its connection to school achievement among black Americans has been vastly underappreciated." Steele defines stereotype threat as follows. It is a disruptive apprehension that one's performance might confirm a negative stereotype about one's group. It can interfere with how well students learn material and perform on exams, despite having very high intellectual potential. It is activated when the student cares about demonstrating excellence on the task. Stereotype threat impairs learning and performance by increasing anxiety, self-doubt, performance monitoring, and mental fatigue, and by decreasing working memory capacity. The effects of stereotype threat on academic performance of blacks, and I should add, other demographic groups who experience academic stigma, has been experimentally tested using the classic research paradigm shown on this slide. Stereotype vulnerable research subjects, say African American college students, are randomized into two groups before taking a test. One group is told that the test is diagnostic of native intelligence, but no mention is made to the other group that the test is diagnostic. Stereotype threat theory predicts that the group told that the test measures native intelligence will perform worse than the group not told this. The theory further predicts that only in the stereotype threat condition, shown here on the left, will black students perform less well, for example, on a difficult vocabulary test than a non-threatened group, say white college students on that same campus. This slide presents results from Steele and Aronson's classic 1995 study, which was conducted at Stanford University. In keeping with the prediction, black students perform less well than white students in the stereotype threat condition, shown on the left, but equally well as whites in the non-threatened condition. Over the past 20 years, findings such as these have been replicated with a variety of student populations, not just with African Americans, and in a variety of academic settings and grade levels. It is an extraordinarily robust research finding. Moreover, as shown on this slide, the simple manipulation of moving the "what is your race" question from placement at the beginning of the test to the end of the test so that black students don't have to think about their race, thereby subconsciously activating stereotype threat, improves their performance to a level comparable to that of whites. For the education system, then, the needed interventions are clear and, if widely adopted, would likely have a major beneficial impact in the decades ahead on our country's racial and socioeconomic health disparities. Let me conclude then with some final words on implications. Given the ideas that I have presented today, I would ask you to consider these points. Implicit anti-Black racial bias is widespread in America, and its harmful effects accumulate and interact across multiple systems to produce entrenched racial health inequities. Two questions. Is implicit bias today the root cause of whites' resistance to social policies that could help Blacks overcome historic disadvantages? And two, is the inability of numerous whites to empathize with Black suffering, unless it is both visible and extreme, the core obstacle to making real progress toward racial equity in America? Let's consider further this important issue of empathy, especially across racial lines. Webster defines empathy as the action of understanding, being aware of, being sensitive to, and vicariously experiencing the feelings, thoughts, and experiences of another. Several neuroscience studies, which I will not review in detail here, found that the neural circuits of the brain believed to be associated with empathy are more likely to be activated when research subjects view individuals of their own race who are experiencing pain than when viewing individuals of a different race who are experiencing pain. Perhaps this helps us to understand why Dylann Roof could do what he did on June 17th of this year, and how 2 days later he could stand there passively, showing no visible emotion to the obvious pain of his victims' family members. And perhaps it also helps us to understand why Senator Jenny Horne's ability to empathize with the deep emotional pain of the victims' family members, in combination with her prestige as a descendant of Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, were so crucial in the ultimate decision to remove the flag from the grounds of the state capitol. Listen carefully to her words. I cannot believe that we do not have the heart in this body to do something meaningful, such as take a symbol of hate off these grounds on Friday. For the widow of Senator Pinckney and his 2 young daughters, that would be adding insult to injury. Her words and moral outrage pierced the thick wall of collective denial in the chamber, and having broken through that denial, presumably aroused enough empathy in her fellow white legislators and in the governor to make the decision to remove the flag not only possible, but in a very real sense, psychologically inevitable. Finally, if we look back just 4 to 5 decades to a time in our nation's history when social policies that could and did improve the material and psychosocial well-being of Black Americans were passed by white-controlled legislatures, often grudgingly, such passage, then as now, always seemed to come after the unwarranted loss of many Black lives, or the unwarranted loss of a very significant Black life. Must the price for progress be so great? No, the price need not be so great. Viable ideas regarding a way forward exist. Ideas that are well grounded in both social science theory and common sense. Our great challenge is to figure out how to get them implemented on a wide enough scale to make a real and lasting difference. Writing on the nature of prejudice more than 60 years ago, the great social psychologist Gordon Allport theorized that racial prejudice could be significantly reduced through meaningful social contact between an in-group, say whites, and an out-group, say blacks, provided 4 conditions are in place. Everyone is treated equally. Common goals are agreed upon and pursued. A successful outcome depends on cooperation, and equal treatment of all group members is enforced by laws or social norms. Decades of scientific research indicate that when these 4 conditions exist, the circle of social inclusion expands, driven by increased knowledge, new bonds of friendship, increased empathy, and reduced bias on the part of the in-group toward the out-group. Theoretically, multiple socially valued outcomes, higher educational achievement, better health, better economic performance, multiple socially valuable outcomes for the group as a whole should be improved as a direct result of a more equitable distribution of problem-solving resources. So to conclude, I believe that much of what we now know about the social determinants of persistent health and other inequities by race, gender, social class, sexual orientation, etc., can be understood and addressed using this theoretical framework. The problem is that there are very few institutions in American society where these conditions exist. And increasing the number of such institutions where they do exist is our nation's great challenge. I do not underestimate the difficulty of accomplishing this, but nor do I believe that we have a choice other than to try. I thank you, and I look forward to your questions and answers. Comments.